What was the key to, what do you feel was the key to producing a moving narrative experience without isolating a global audience? Because it does have remarkable reach, considering that it is a game that's very, very firmly based in faith.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. We knew that a lot of the gamer audience, not only are they not Christians, a lot of them have been very alienated by the church and alienated by Christians. A lot of gamers see themselves as sort of the fringe of society and a little bit outside. So it would be easy, I think, for a game about faith to turn off a video game audience. I think that what we found is that we gained a lot just by sharing our story. We told our testimony, is how we would say it in a very church way, but we just shared our story, and everyone was glad for us to tell our story. They understood that faith was a crucial part of our story, that it was a very key component to us walking out this experience with our son, and no one begrudged us that. I shared with some of the faculty earlier that, you know, in every corner of the internet, you'll find a few trolls, and so anytime our article came out, there'd be comments here and there, and there'd be people that were angry that our faith was in the game, and almost every time there'd be an atheist that would pop up and say they should be allowed to share their story if this is what they believe. And we found we never had to defend ourselves, that we had defenders everywhere in the industry, because I think when you tell your own story, it's disarming. I think sometimes when we come with an agenda or we're trying to preach something specifically, people can be kind of turned off from that, but that really people welcome you sharing your own story with some vulnerability, because that's very human. We all have stories, and we're all willing to listen to someone else's story, even if their experience is vastly different from our own.
Thank you. And so kind of leading off of that, knowing that there was an audience that was receptive to this, what do you feel the biggest challenge to the faith-based side of game development is, outside of, you know, what would be the obvious?
Sure. You know, I think that one of the bigger challenges for faith-based game designers is trying to figure out where they fit within the industry. So in other areas of media, we've seen Christians kind of break off from the main industry. So you've got secular music and you have Christian music, and you have secular films and you have Christian films. And I think that Christian game designers are kind of trying to explore where they fit within the industry. I think that some have made some very Christian games. I think that there are a lot of Christians in the industry just working for big companies. You'd never know they were there, and they're maybe making their influence in the little ways that they can make their influence. But I think one of the bigger challenges for Christians in the industry is going to be just finding ways to engage with the industry, of showing up at the Game Developers Conference, showing up at PAX, submitting to programs like Indie Mega Booth and just these other programs that provide opportunities for video games to be shown. We found that if we engage with the industry, they totally give us a seat at the table. So I think it's just trying to figure out where they'll land. My hope is that they don't land in a separate section, but that they find a way to really dig into the industry as it exists right now.
Okay, and so leading into sort of infiltrating the industry and having an opportunity for all of these different stories, what is the number one way that we can make a substantial difference to kind of culture as a whole as game developers? Like what are those things that we want to be doing and looking at introducing into the industry?
Sure. I mean, I think that, I've said already, but I'm a big proponent of telling your own story. I think that everyone has a story that they can tell that is personal, that is something that they have felt and experienced in a very real way. And I think sometimes it's easier to write someone else's story, right? To think of some big dramatic scene, but if you've struggled with anxiety, if you've struggled with depression, like any of those real human things that we all encounter, those are the things that your audience is going to relate to also. The things that are hard for you are hard for them. And so if you share that story and you're vulnerable with them, and in the middle of that, you have a slightly different perspective because you have a slightly different worldview, I think that's intriguing and interesting to people. I think that as we create video games, I always think about how Jesus told his stories through parables a lot of the times. So for the average listener, it was just a really good story. And then later, when he wanted to, he unpacked it for people. I think Christians can take parables and make amazing video games out of them, because not the parables in the Bible. I'm saying you can tell, which some people have done, but I don't for me personally, I don't think that's the way to go, is to retell Bible stories. Those exist. But I think that if you take truths that God has given you, things you want to teach, things you think the Holy Spirit is leading you to put in a video game, and you think of it like a parable, you can tell an amazing story that the world will love. And later, when people ask you, because they will ask you, what made you think of that? How did you do that? What did that mean when you did this? Then there's something for you to unpack. And that's how Jesus did things, that he wasn't always preaching at people. A lot of times he was just telling stories. And later, as people wanted to, they could press in and he could go a little deeper. And so we found that works really well. Even a lot of the things in our video game that are symbolic aren't symbolisms that everyone would get, but if a Christian plays it, they have one experience, and if someone else plays it, they have a slightly different experience, but it should speak to both audiences.
Great. So what are some common misconceptions about the work that you do, and how can we combat these misconceptions and communicate more effectively?
Sure. Probably the biggest misconception that people have is they just tend to think of video games as all one thing. So if an article comes out that says, parents, make a video game about child's cancer, then immediately there'll be 15 comments underneath the article that say, cancer is not a game, how dare you, cancer is not a game, usually from people that didn't read the full article. And I think I understand that because we think of a game as a way to escape or something to entertain us or something that's fun. But just like there's genres within films, not every film is a romantic comedy. Schindler's List exists, right? And I don't go to Schindler's List and say, well, that didn't entertain me, so that is not a movie. But we do that with video games, where we think all video games should be one thing, or a couple things, but they should be fun and they should be an escape. I think that there's room for the industry to grow, and I think the industry has been growing, and it's just a matter of people kind of seeking out experiences a little bit on the fringe of video games and discovering these kinds of projects that speak to deeper issues. And so I think that's a shift that's happening slowly with culture, but definitely one that actually, I think there's tons of room for growth within the church. I think that the world in general is starting to see that video games aren't all one thing, but still within churches, I think there's a lot of like, oh, video games, I don't know about that. There's a lot of bad content in those video games. Let's just not look at it, instead of trying to figure out what exists that is good and what could we add to this conversation that's happening in video games.
So we're almost wrapped up. I just have two more. What is one piece of practical advice that you would give to anyone starting out who's interested in generating these kinds of experiences?
Sure. Wow, I probably have a couple of pieces of advice. The first one I would say is find a team. Video games are so expensive to make. They are big undertakings. We were a small team, but we had an artist, a technical artist, 2 programmers, a sound designer. I was writing and doing some game design. So we still had a team of 6 or 7 and even brought in a producer toward the end. It's really hard to make something good all alone. So find a team of people who you like and who you can work with. And then my other big piece of advice, if you're starting out, is to start much smaller than you think. Even with that Dragon Cancer, we had this whole idea that we would have this world taking place with Joel, but then we'd have this other kind of fantastical world, and the two would play to, we'd kind of had these 2 or 3 concepts all rolled into one, and very early in the process, someone, I think at Sony, actually told us, no, this is your game right here, just this one part, you don't need the rest of it, which was heartbreaking for us, because we were like, no, we want to tell this whole big thing, but just like any other kind of storytelling, editing is most of the storytelling. It's true if you're making films and if you're editing video and if you're writing a story, the editing is where the story comes from. And that's true with video games, that you will almost always have a game 3 or 4 times bigger than you can really produce. So start really, really small. Think of one concept. Start with that concept and go, how do I tell that? How do I make a mechanic that would really express that well? And when you start small, what we had to do to be willing to kind of let go of wanting to say so much in one video game was just trust that if I start small and that we do something that really works and that we're proud of, we're going to have other opportunities. So I don't need to say everything there is to say in this game. I'm going to trust that I can have other games, and in those other games I can explore these other topics.
Right. So actually, based off of the way you answered that, we sort of got onto my last one, but I do have sort of a final question that what you sort of said, triggered in me, where I'm thinking, how do we create a call to action? We have so many people in this room who are inspired and encouraged by what video games can do and what they're capable of. And for those of us who haven't even stuck a toe in the pool yet, this today has sort of been, a Genesis moment for some people. What would be your call to action for people who don't know how to get involved?
Sure.
So.
I'm a big fan of game jams. So a game jam is this concept where you maybe take 24 or 48 hours, maybe at most 72 hours. You get in a little team, maybe with people you've never worked with before, and you see what you could create in that period of time. What could I make in 1 day? What could I make in 2 days? What could I make in 3 days? And it's so helpful because it makes you risk something. It makes you experiment. And it makes you think really small because you can't create a game that takes 3 years to make in a game jam. And so it's just a great way to experiment and to meet people and to get started in video games. My husband and his business partner for this video game met in what they called a meaningful game jam. And the idea was just to create a meaningful game mechanic over 48 hours. And they made different things, but they really enjoyed each other's projects, and that's how they started working together. So sometimes you meet some people in a game jam, whether you partnered with them or someone else, but you start to find your people that kind of think like you, and you start to realize, like, oh, I kind of want to make what that guy's making. I'm going to go see what he's doing, or I want to see what she's exploring over here. But it's just a great way to practice without a lot of risk, because everyone knows that everything being made there was made in 2 days. So you're not expecting the Mona Lisa. You know that you're talking on this really small scale, but it's a great way to get started.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that. Thank you again for taking the opportunity to be out here tonight and for being generous with your time and your past experience. I think we're going to hand this back off to Dean Wynn for just a moment, but Tina Wynn, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.